I think probably the single biggest barrier that would need to be discussed in tremendous length would be the day when a country, we don't know who it would be, decides to allow the autonomy of lethal decision making. Now, my understanding is that would go counter to everything in Western military tradition to take the human out of the loop on a lethal decision. But just because the West may not do it doesn't mean another country may not do it. How do you think about a future in which some actor, and maybe it's a non state actor, has utilized the technology for a relatively inexpensive drone, let's say, that can make its own killing decisions? How science fiction is that, first of all? And if it's not science fiction, um, what would that represent for the world to confront as a new threat?
Yeah, it's a very good question and something that we discussed recently in my elective at the U.S. Army War College called Emerging Technologies in War. To what degree does the current U.S. policy, which actually stipulates human oversight, meaningful human control, appropriate human judgment, whatever sort of term you want to use, it approximates what we're talking about on these capabilities. It's actually codified in a recently published Department of Defense directive that we, the U.S. military, would not outsource to a machine the ability to apply lethal force on the battlefield. But to your point, that doesn't mean that our adversaries would not. So I think that if we confronted this development, and by the way, there are some that say we already have in Libya recently with a so-called lethal autonomous weapon system, in Ukraine at very tactical levels. The evidence in both cases is fairly scant. But let's assume we haven't. But if we enter a world where we do have the ability for these machines to make life or death decisions, that would be rather paradigmatic and potentially would collapse the sort of nature and character of warfare in such a way where it's not just about the use of these capabilities on the battlefield, but the way that they can now drive why we go to war in the first place, which is about the nature of warfare in terms of the politicization of the use of force abroad or even within countries' own borders. So I think this is fairly problematic to consider in terms of what it could mean for our standard sort of trope of the nature versus the character of war. It gets a little bit more, if not a lot more, sort of scary, frankly, when we start talking about the way that we could calibrate machine oversight of different capabilities to include even pre-delegation of command and control of nuclear weapon systems, right? And so there are those who talk about the inability of large language models, which is what we're really talking about for decision making, to sensibly confront crisis escalation, a la what we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And I'll assume some of our listeners have an understanding of what that looks like. When we take a look at these models that govern decision making in an autonomous sort of way for nuclear command and control, what we see is rapid escalation in the crisis to the point where these models will recommend the potential use of at least tactical nuclear weapons, which are fairly nasty in and of themselves. And my response to scholars and practitioners who often question why is, should we be so surprised? I mean, these language models are built upon 50 years of classical deterrence theory, which have talked about deterrence by denial and punishment and the potential for chance leading to unintended consequences, which should stymie escalation in the first place. And so that's just on the one hand. On the other hand, there are people who say that actually pre-delegating command and control of nuclear weapons to a machine could enhance the credibility of your deterrent in the first place, which is a uber scary sort of prospect in and of itself. And so I think when we enter a world with decision making made by machines, we start to confront paradigmatic shifts in a Kuhnian sort of way on the current frameworks that security scholars draw from to understand how to manage crisis escalation and order building in the first place. Now, the final point I want to make on this question, real quick, Brian, is this: when we talk, is another definitional issue, but it's really important. When we talk about AI-enabled warfare, right? And you can take a look at Paul Shari, you can take a look at other sort of very outspoken scholars in the DC Beltway. What you see is, hey, AI is paradigmatic, it's game changing, it's going to change the world, it already is changing the world. What you don't often get is sort of theorizing about what that may mean that leads to the ability for work like I do, which is hypothesis testing, right? And tough sort of social science, right? And so what I do in my research is I define AI enabled warfare is a function of the level of use, tactically or strategically, and with what degree of human oversight, machine or human oversight. And that allows me to build sort of what we call middle range theory that's useful for policy, right? And so I can say that the tactical use of AI with human oversight is what we call centaur warfare. So this pulls from Greek mythology with sort of the torso, the head, arms of a man, and the body of a beast, right? The legs of a beast, versus minotaur warfare, which is about machine oversight of humans at the tactical level, which we actually kind of already have with capabilities. One example would be the CRAM, which is a big machine gun that protects installations from incoming artillery from the enemy. When we scale up to the strategic level, we start talking about mosaic warfare, human oversight of machines, decision support systems. Project Maven, for instance, is a great example of this, versus the real sort of dystopian outcome here, which is machine oversight at the strategic level, which is kind of what we're talking about, the AI general, the singleton. And so I started in talking about current frameworks that would be challenged with the advancement of machine decision making for the use of force, God forbid, nuclear weapons, and that the way that that would overcome our current frameworks of understanding. And I ended with potentially a new framework to understand what it is we're talking about that allows people who build military capability and people who manage it to have a better sense about the sort of intended consequences of their use.